He said, Winston is a man of real genius, but he also has the defects of his qualities, because he seeks instinctively for the large and preferably the novel idea, such as is capable of representation by the broadest brush. And his part is to brush in broad splashes of paint with highlights and deep shadows. Accuracy of drawing is beyond his ken. So that's Chamberlain's sense of Churchill, the man for the big splash of colour, not careful drawing, not careful thinking. And he likens Winston to a, quote, wayward child who compels admiration, but who wears out his guardians with the constant strain he puts upon them.
Welcome to Creating Churchill, an alternative biography of soldier, journalist, war leader and greatest Briton, Winston Churchill. His story has been told so many times, his bulldog image has become so familiar, that today Churchill can seem more meme than man. So this podcast series aims to get closer to the real Churchill, seeing him once again as his contemporaries saw him, the people he collaborated or clashed with. I'm Russell Barnes and I'm talking with historian David Reynolds, exploring how Churchill's life and character were shaped by relationships with friends, rivals, enemies and family. In this episode, seeing Winston Churchill through the lens of his great rivalry during the 1920s and 30s with Neville Chamberlain. Churchill and Chamberlain collaborated and competed in and out of government, and both had their eyes on the top job, being Prime Minister. And it was Chamberlain who in 1937 got there first. So David, in this episode, we're going to be looking at Winston Churchill through the lens of a rival, Neville Chamberlain, with whom he collaborated and competed in and out of government in the 1920s and 1930s. This was quite a long, drawn-out relationship, with both of them eyeing the ultimate prize, the premiership. And it was Chamberlain who actually got there first, and from 1937 to 1940.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was a long, drawn-out relationship, an intense one. And they had so many dealings with each other in cabinet and in parliament and so on. But in other ways, they hardly knew each other socially. And there is a story which is quite fascinating, I think, of that when Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in Chamberlain's government, War Cabinet, in September 1939, he and his wife invited Chamberlain and his wife to dinner in the Admiralty as a kind of social event and to get to know each other. And the evening went on and Chamberlain became a little more unbuttoned, and he got into telling a story about how he'd spent 5 years on Andros Island, which is out in the Bahamas in the 1890s, trying to recoup the family's fortunes, business fortunes, by growing sisal. Sisal was the backing for carpets and things like that, the sort of stiff fabric you had. So it's economically significant, but it's a pretty grim business doing this. And it was very frustrating for Chamberlain. So I think Chamberlain told it as more of an anecdote, but Churchill was quite struck by it. And in his war memoirs, he said that Hitler never understood in 1938 that, quote, he was actually talking to a hard-bitten pioneer from the outer marches of the British Empire.
Yeah.
When Winston's wife, Clementine, read that in draft, she thought it was all a bit over the top. But Churchill clearly felt that this was a revealing aspect of Chamberlain, and it showed just how little he knew about Chamberlain's background and personality before they were finally in government together in 1939 and 1940.
So, David, in your book, Mirrors of Greatness, you point out that this was not just a kind of personal rivalry, but actually almost a dynastic one. These are two major political families competing.
Yes, they were. If you take it back into the 19th century, Joe Chamberlain, that's Neville's father, and Randolph Churchill, that's Winston's father, were both major figures, really dynamic figures in the politics of the 1880s. Joe was a self-made businessman from Birmingham. His firm made screws and metal goods. He became Lord Mayor of Birmingham, rose up the ladder in liberal politics. Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, was very different, a sort of rakish Tory aristocrat. But they were both politicians of brilliance, really, and also very opportunist. Each of them took on his own prime minister and lost. But whereas Lord Salisbury destroyed Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, Joe Chamberlain successfully splintered the old Liberal Party, the Liberal Party of Gladstone, over the issue of Home Rule for Ireland. He took with him a large number of supporters from the Liberal Party into alliance with the Tory Party. They called themselves the Unionists over the question of Ireland and the union with Britain. And Chamberlain served in government until 1905. Then he was stricken with a stroke, semi-paralyzed, but he lived on until 1914, just weeks before the Great War broke out. Right. So this was very much a sense of the Chamberlain dynasty, and a Churchill dynasty that had misfired, if you like, in Lord Randolph's time. But Winston was very conscious of that dynastic inheritance, as I think he vied with Neville Chamberlain, for political leadership in the 20th century.
And looking at their dates then, so Winston would have crossed over with Radical Joe Chamberlain in the house at some point. They must have known each other.
Winston writes in his own memoirs, he said, Joe Chamberlain was the man who made the political weather. That was his expression when Winston entered politics as a young man. And they actually talked quite a bit when Winston was writing the biography of his father, at a time when he too had changed parties, though he'd moved from the Tories to the Liberals, the opposite direction from Joe. And they talked about Lord Randolph Churchill. They talked about the politics of the time. And Winston said he felt that he'd had more real talks with Joe Chamberlain than he'd been able to have with his own father, which was very poignant in a way.
So getting to Neville now, who was Neville Chamberlain then? How does he fit into this picture?
Okay, so Joe Chamberlain has two sons. The elder, Austin Chamberlain, was groomed for politics. He was clearly intended to be Joe Chamberlain's successor, right down to the fact that he too had a monocle in one eye and he had orchids in his buttonhole. It was almost a parody. So Austin was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge. He then was at Sciences Po in Paris. He was, introduced to international affairs. And his great moment was as Tory Foreign Secretary in 1925, when he helped to negotiate the Locarno Treaty. And this was a treaty that secured peace, it seemed, between Germany, France and Belgium, and Britain and Italy were the signatories, the guarantors. And Austin Chamberlain won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. So there's a big contrast between Austin and Neville. He's the younger brother, a half-brother, because he's the son of a second marriage for Joe Chamberlain. And Neville was quite simply intended to run the family business. He was sent to a place called Mason Science College in Birmingham and then studied accountancy. Then he was packed off for this 5 years of trying to grow sisal in the Bahamas. So really, this is the marginalized younger brother with a very, very slow and difficult start. But then he came back from the Bahamas to Birmingham. He developed his own firm, and you could get a sense of somebody who had been really frustrated and really now had got the bit between his teeth. He rose in local politics in Birmingham, became Lord Mayor of Birmingham, and then he got into the government during World War I, Lloyd George's government during World War I, and that's where his own career developed.
Right.
So, in fact, then he eclipses his older brother. Austin's career fizzles out in the late 1920s, whereas Neville now is rising fast in Tory politics. And you could really imagine that part of what was pushing Neville to succeed was a sense of sibling rivalry. That was part of what was going on there.
And he made one advance with fashion. He didn't go for the monocle.
No, he didn't. He had a brisk little moustache and all the rest of it. No, he wasn't playing the role of Joe's son.
Yeah.
He was, I think, beginning to carve out his own identity in politics.
Yeah. So in the 1920s, then, you've got Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain. They're becoming the big beasts, if you like, of national politics.
Yeah.
But they're very different kinds of politicians. I mean, how would you characterize the style of each, and how do they contrast?
Well, Neville's very buttoned up and organized and has little time for people who aren't. And he's particularly develops a very disdainful, sarcastic attitude to the Labour Party, really rubs them up. He really thinks they're almost intellectually beneath him.
Right.
Whereas Churchill, who could certainly, didn't suffer fools gladly either, but he could really, as a showman, he handled Labour Party in a different way, with humour, with charm. And Neville Chamberlain himself admitted in 1927 that Winston has no equal in the House of Commons.
Right.
And he cited, this was in a letter to his sisters, he cites an occasion when there had been just a lot of Labour interruptions when Churchill was giving a speech on trade union reform. And eventually he stopped. And he said, of course, it's perfectly possible for honourable members opposite to prevent my speaking. And indeed, I do not want to cast my pearls before... And then there was a loaded pause, and the anger opposite mounted. They're just waiting for him to say, cast my pearls before swine. And then he comes up with the punchline. He says, before those who do not want them. And the timing was perfect, and it provoked what Chamberlain called a roar of delight that lasted several minutes.
Yeah.
So this was a completely different way of handling politics and political style from the Chamberlain's manner. And it clearly made a difference. And in fact, actually, that contrast in manner and the way he rubbed up the Labour Party in the 20s would linger, and it made a big difference in May 1940 about why Labour refused to serve in a coalition government led by Chamberlain.
It's interesting because Churchill does have a bit of a common touch, doesn't he? He is able, I remember all the footage of him touring the East End of London after aerial bombing in the war. His charisma is such that he is able to engage with people who aren't his class. I mean, he is very much an aristocrat, and he knows it.
Yes.
And yet he has something of a common touch, I think.
Yes, he does. And Chamberlain isn't devoid of this. I mean, in some ways, he's got a better sort of newsreel manner than Churchill has. Churchill, as a speechmaker, is very formal, and he loves the set piece things in the Commons, although he can do that kind of repartee across the benches. But when Chamberlain was giving his budgets in the 1930s as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he does little pieces for the newsreel. He's quite conscious of the way that you've got to communicate now with the masses. And there's a real skill and timing to the way he handles that. But of course, he's just dealing with the camera. He's not dealing with MPs opposite who really get under his skin.
Yeah.
So they're complex figures. They have their own strengths and their weaknesses. I suppose the important thing is really that both of them, Winston and Neville, understand that the electorate is hugely bigger now in the 1920s than it had been before the franchise reforms in 1918, when all men got the vote and also a significant number of women. And so they're talking to a different audience, including a female audience, which they're trying to cultivate in their own ways.
Yeah. Having, edited these history films that we've made together and Chamberlain's newsreels as Chancellor in the 30s, he does come across as surprisingly modern. He is very direct, as you say, very good communicator, uses humour and clever pausing and one-liners, and he's much more sophisticated. He's not the old doddering man with a piece of paper that we perhaps have in a kind of national image.
Yeah.
He's quite sophisticated and quite with it, as it were. Whereas, as you say, Churchill, very uncomfortable, I think, on camera.
He loves the House of Commons. He loves that platform and that theatre, whereas Chamberlain is more accomplished in more modern facets of communication.
Going back to the 1920s, in 1924, both Chamberlain and Churchill are given cabinet posts in Stanley Baldwin's government. Winston as Chancellor of the Exchequer, his father's old job, and Neville as Minister of Health. How did they get along in those roles? Because they must be very closely tied. I mean, were they rivals at that stage?
I suppose you could say it's a sort of relationship of competitive cooperation. And sometimes the competition is uppermost, sometimes the cooperation is, but it's always up and down. They're both men of energy, drive, and ambition. Each is looking to make his mark. And what's interesting is that when Churchill's thinking about how to make an impact, he says in 1924, straight away, he urges the cabinet to concentrate, he says, on a few great issues in the social sphere, such as housing, health insurance, pensions. So these are the kind of things that will appeal to this new electorate, a social agenda. Right. And Chamberlain is saying much the same sort of thing. He's got a list of 25 measures for Parliament to pass on things to do with those issues of housing and health insurance and so on. And what happens is that Churchill, as he did with Lloyd George before the Great War, Churchill sees the benefit in working with another like-minded minister, that if you do that, it has a kind of multiplier effect, because two of you together, it almost takes over the government's agenda. So what he does in 1925 is he offers to find money for Chamberlain's pension scheme by increasing the death duties, the inheritance tax, and also cutting naval expenditure. And this makes possible the Widows, Orphans and Old Age Pensions Act that Chamberlain pushes through as Minister of Health. And that's a landmark piece of social legislation. It's the first time the UK had contributory scheme of state pensions. It covers, I think, something like 50 million people. Yeah. Now, some of Chamberlain's staff are indignant that Churchill was taking some of the credit, but Chamberlain acknowledges that Churchill was essential in making it happen. He writes in his diary, "We were pledged to do something of this kind, but I don't think we'd have done it this year if he hadn't made it part of his budget scheme." So Chamberlain, he can see this man is a significant figure. And he says to his sister, he writes to his sisters, "I like him. I like his humor and his vitality. I admire his courage." But then he adds in this letter, "There is yet something of a great gulf fixed between us, which I don't think I shall ever cross." And that's a very, I think, perceptive phrase, because there is a gulf. They never cross it. So it gives you a sense of the texture of the relationship.
Yeah, but I'm interested in that phrase, great gulf. What do you think he meant by it? And how would it show itself?
Well, I mean, let me give you another example. I think this is one that helps to bring out a kind of answer to your point. So in 1926, there's a general strike, which takes the government's attention and the country's attention away from things. But in 1927, Chamberlain's big idea is to sweep away the old poor law, which had last been reformed in the 1830s. And this was part of that antiquated way of providing relief for real poverty in the localities, was part of Chamberlain's effort to have a complete shake-up of local government. What Winston wants to do is help recovery from the slump of the 1920s through a £30 million reduction in the rates, which is a local property tax. And this would be covered by further cuts in naval spending and also a new tax on petrol. This is now beginning to be the age of the motor car.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, of course, we think of Churchill as someone who was so gung-ho about the military side of things. Here you've got a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's seeking to cut naval spending. So it's kind of ironic.
His old department.
Yeah, well, it's his department, that's right. And that's as Lloyd George said, that's what Winston tends to focus on. It's whatever will advance that department when he's in charge. Anyway, so what he's coming up with are more cuts that would help to finance the Chamberlain local government bill. And he says that doing these cuts would enable us to make Chamberlain's bill the greatest measure of the Parliament. Now, what's interesting this time is that Chamberlain draws back. And don't really know why, but Perhaps he just didn't want to share the limelight again with Churchill. Certainly he thought that the cuts were too radical.
Right.
And I think he was also getting tired of what you might call the heavy lifting involved in working with Churchill.
Mm.
And what he says to his sister, and these letters to his sisters are very revealing. It's almost like they're acting as a sort of confessional for him. But he says, as usual, Winston looks not at the merits, but at the electioneering value of any project that I put up to him. And he seems to want to draw me into some new mad idea, which is at present simmering in that volatile and turbulent brain of his.
Right.
So this is a sense now of the disadvantages of working with Churchill.
Yeah.
They argue about these schemes all through the winter of 1927-8. It's a big argument within cabinet. Eventually, there are some compromises reached and so on. But Chamberlain drew a lasting conclusion. And he says this in another letter. He said, Winston is a man of real genius, but he also has the defects of his qualities, because he seeks instinctively for the large and preferably the novel idea, such as is capable of representation by the broadest brush. And his part is to brush in broad splashes of paint with highlights and deep shadows. Accuracy of drawing is beyond his ken. Mm-hmm. Accuracy of drawing is beyond his understanding.
Yeah.
So that's Chamberlain's sense of Churchill, the man for the big splash of colour, not careful drawing, not careful thinking. And he likens Winston to a, quote, wayward child who compels admiration, but who wears out his guardians with the constant strain he puts upon them. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is why in the 1930s, he does all he can to keep Winston out of government. If you like, it's the same common complaint that Lloyd George made in 1916. He said of Winston, his steering gear is too weak for his horsepower.
Yeah. That's an interesting common refrain, as you say, amongst with people who work closely with him. And I suppose there are lots of echoes today. We talk about government by press release, don't we? People who are constantly dreaming up big schemes that don't really have the kind of detail to back them up. Boris Johnson being an obvious one. But I mean, I don't think this is probably fair on Churchill.
Well, you have to make an impact. You have to catch the headlines. And there's a temptation to, particularly if you're on the back foot, as it were, to look for things that you can do in a rush, even if they aren't thought through. Yeah. Now, Churchill, I would say, was someone who did think more carefully about his schemes than others did. Certainly the contrast with Boris Johnson, since you mentioned it, I think is very striking. Yeah. Churchill was more a man of detail, but there's certainly a sense with Churchill that he always has an eye for impact, and sometimes he'll cut corners in order to make that impact.
So in 1929, the Tories lose power to Labour, and then Churchill is left out in the cold in 1931 when a national government forms because of the economic crisis. Was there a sense now in the 1931, 1932 that Churchill's star was falling and Chamberlain was very much on the rise?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. What's clear is that neither Baldwin nor Chamberlain want Churchill in any government they're running in the 1930s. They certainly didn't want these big splashes of technicolor when they've got a really serious depression now and the war clouds are gathering across Europe. And in a way, I mean, what Winston tries to do all through the 1930s is actually in some ways counterproductive, because what he's doing is seen as ploys to attract attention. So he opposes Baldwin's plans for devolution in India. He supports Edward VIII during the abdication crisis.
Right.
And then most of all, he keeps banging the drum for rapid rearmament. And there's a tendency to feel, look, this is what Winston's just making noise to attract attention and make a nuisance of himself. So we'll have to have him back inside the government. And Chamberlain doesn't deny that rearmament's necessary. He's not opposed to rearmament. He just doesn't want it to be so rapid that it might undermine the economy, the financial reserves, confidence in the pound, because Chamberlain is very clear as Chancellor of the Exchequer that It's on that economy, on those financial reserves. Those will be crucial for Britain to wage a long war if it came. So he doesn't want to damage that by too rapid rearmament.
Right.
And he writes to his sisters in 1936, he says, I am thankful we do not have Winston as a colleague. He is in his usual excited condition that comes on him when he smells war. And if he were in the cabinet, we should be spending all our time in holding him down instead of getting on with our business. That's the view of him. Winston inside the cabinet, we'd have to hold him down, restrain him. He's not going to help our business. He's going to be a distraction. So it's a very, very clear view of the kind of liability of having Churchill in government that they have by this stage.
Yeah, and the energy you need to have him as a colleague, to respond to his energy, to his constant critique, I suppose, and debate. And this goes back to what we've been talking about generally about being collegiate and being, the glowworm rather than the worm, I suppose. In May 1937, Chamberlain finally becomes Prime Minister. And then, obviously, he and Churchill clash again in the most serious way. And that's about appeasement.
Yeah. So after Hitler takes over Austria in March 1938, Churchill publicly warns that Europe was now confronted, he says, with a program of aggression, nicely calculated and timed, unfolding stage by stage. So Churchill makes it very clear how he views Hitler and what Hitler's trying to do. And Churchill calls for Britain and France to conclude a treaty for mutual defense against aggression. He says, backed by staff arrangements, closer relations between the two armed forces and better military planning. And this is to deter war or to get ready to fight it. Either way, it's necessary to do this, and he's very clear on it. Chamberlain takes a different view, and he believes that he can avert the threat of war by personally becoming a peacemaker. And this is the moment where Chamberlain's sense of being captivated by the drama of office and the opportunities of office really takes over in a way that I think sometimes we forget now because we know the whole story so well and what happened over Munich and so on. But just to spell it out, in September 1938, Chamberlain flies to meet Hitler in a dramatic effort for peace. He has 3 meetings with Hitler over a matter of a couple of weeks. And he does this because, like most of the people in government in London, he believes that a war in Europe would begin with a massive series of devastating German air raids on London and on other British cities, in which thousands of people would be killed. So this is the impetus behind this. A European war is going to be devastating for Britain and for London itself. So I would say, if you like, he takes to the air to stop the threat from the air.
Right, yeah.
And in doing so, I would argue that he establishes modern summitry.
Well, I remember, obviously, we made a series of films about summits based on your book. And we covered Chamberlain's 3 visits to Germany. And what really struck me from it, we think of Hitler as it totally irrational and so on, but actually he proved a very skilled negotiator. He made demands, Chamberlain agreed those demands, and then almost the next day or the next meeting, he would up his demands, put a timeline on them, or incremental changes that really were very difficult for Chamberlain to deal with. But in a sense, Chamberlain as well brought the problem on himself, because he, certainly the first meeting, as far as I understand it, as far as I remember it, he went in without his own interpreter, without even an official note taker from the British side. He was somebody who was really kind of going into the lion's den, very vulnerable.
Yes, he had a big idea, but once he got into it, he was out of his depth. The idea was incredible. You have to remember that what we now think of as shuttle diplomacy, summitry, rushing around the world, meeting other leaders, which is so familiar in our time, but it was an incredible shock. In 1938, in September 38, the news that Chamberlain was flying to meet Hitler was front page news in the media, newsreels in Britain and around the world. It was absolutely gripping. The problem was that he had little idea how to carry it out.
Mm.
And it's almost like the whole thing's turned around. It's Chamberlain who's now desperate to make the big splash, of which he'd been accusing Winston in the 1920s. And he's the one who loses track of accuracy of drawing. So you mentioned that first meeting with Hitler at Berchtesgaden. Yes, Chamberlain had brought some other people with him, including his senior advisor, Horace Wilson. But when he arrived at Berchtesgaden in the hotel, Hitler invited him for a meeting, and Chamberlain thought this would basically be a cup of tea and a chat and so on. Hitler didn't do cups of tea and chats. He wanted business immediately, and he was in a very high state of excitement. And so Chamberlain simply went up there without any entourage. He deliberately didn't take an interpreter to show that he was trusting of Hitler's interpreter and so on. And then they ended up having a really detailed discussion about the parts of Czechoslovakia that Hitler wanted. And by the time Chamberlain went back to the hotel down at the bottom of the mountain, he'd basically done all the business. There wasn't anything more to do except go home and see if the cabinet would accept it. Now, that is just completely stupid. He'd really not thought this through at all. And he was in a similar situation at all the other meetings. Increasingly, it was the cabinet who was pushing him. And back in London, Churchill, the man who supposedly was keen on all these big splashes of paint, he's arguing for calmness, for patience, continuing to rearm and calling Hitler's bluff. So it's a very different attitude to the one that Chamberlain had adopted in this almost desperate moment of trying to keep Europe at peace.
Yeah. And after that second visit to Bad Godesberg, it seemed that Chamberlain's whole grand gesture had failed, really. The cabinet blocked further concessions. And then on the 27th of September, Britain and France told Hitler they would declare war if he invaded Czechoslovakia. So it seemed like that was going to be the point at which we were going to go to war.
Yes. So Chamberlain did tell Hitler, he sent a message saying that he was still ready for a further meeting. But on the 28th, when he rose to address the Commons that afternoon, he got no reply. And he talked for an hour or so, and he was giving a detailed account of the negotiations. But he must have been very aware that he had no great punchline at the end, that it looked like Britain was going to war with Germany. And then what happened, as Chamberlain put it later, he said it was a piece of drama that no work of fiction ever surpassed. About 4:15, the audience was distracted from what he was saying by mutterings and movement around the speaker's chair. And then a piece of papers passed along the government benches. And everybody in the galleries could sense that this was important. Chamberlain stopped his speech to scrutinize the papers. And then one MP, Harold Nicholson, wrote that his whole face, his whole body seemed to change. He appeared 10 years younger and triumphant. And then he spoke again to the Commons and he said, "I have now been informed by Herr Hitler that he invites me to meet him at Munich tomorrow morning." And the Commons erupted in cheers. It was, as Chamberlain said, it was an incredible piece of totally spontaneous, unexpected political theatre.
I mean, effectively, Hitler blinked. He blinked first at that point.
Hitler blinked first, and that is something that we often forget. Of course, the denouement is different, but it was at that point Hitler knew that the German public were not keen on the possibility of another war. He was warned by his military that they were not prepared for a war with Britain and France. Italy had made it clear, Mussolini had made it clear that he wasn't getting involved. So Hitler actually pulled back at that point. And for that moment, the initiative had passed to Chamberlain.
So Chamberlain was on a high now. How did Churchill greet this moment?
Well, so the House of Commons is in turmoil. MPs are standing on the benches, cheering away and all the rest of it. Churchill's one of the few people to remain seated. Eventually, he walks over to Chamberlain and wishes him Godspeed for his trip to Munich. But he adds, "You were very lucky."
And so the trip next day is to Munich. I remember tracking through Munich on a recce and trying to find the exact place where the conference and signature had taken place.
It's a music school, wasn't it?
It was a music school. It had been converted into a music school. And the room in which the actual signing took place, in which one of those rare occasions where we see Hitler with glasses as he makes the signature, I think it had a huge grand piano in it. And I remember us filming in there. We did a piece to camera. And I think in the end, we had to put the grand piano in the background because we couldn't find a way. It was so big. We couldn't find a way to angle anything without the piano. Very atmospheric place. Slightly strange that it's being used now in that way, in a rather wonderful way. And the sound of kind of violins in the distance down the corridor.
Sound of music instead of the sound of war, yes. That was where the actual agreement was signed, giving away most of the parts of Czechoslovakia that Hitler wanted, the Sudetenland, but over a slightly longer timetable than he'd originally demanded. So essentially he got what he wanted, but just the timing was a bit different. Once again, Chamberlain had kind of capitulated. But the signature that really mattered to Chamberlain was not the one in the big conference hall, but it was the following day on another document. And we drove out to a place that had been Hitler's private apartment in the suburb of Munich. And this was where Chamberlain and Hitler signed their own document, not involving this time the French and the Italians and so on. And that was a piece of paper promising that Britain and Germany would never again wage war against each other. And that's the famous piece of paper that when he returns in triumph to London, Chamberlain waves before the euphoric crowds and declares it's peace for our time, peace for our time. And that's what will be always on Chamberlain's political obituaries and in the history books. Chamberlain, Munich, peace for our time.
Yeah. And what was Churchill thinking at this point? I mean, an extraordinary moment, all that exultation.
It's almost as if Chamberlain's walking on water. And Churchill really sticks his neck out in standing up against what Chamberlain's done. He speaks out in the House of Commons on the 5th of October, I think, and denounces really the 3 trips and meetings that Chamberlain's had, meetings with Hitler. And he says this rather nice sort of analogy. He said, £1 was demanded at the pistol point. When it was given, £2 were demanded at the pistol point. Finally, the dictator consented to take £1, 17 shillings and sixpence, and the rest in promises of goodwill for the future. So what he's saying really is that summatory Chamberlain style wasn't diplomatic negotiations, it was highway robbery. And Churchill predicted in that speech that the rump state of Czechoslovakia, what had been left of Czechoslovakia, would soon, he said, be engulfed in the Nazi regime. Perhaps within months, he said. And he wasn't far off. It was actually 4.5 months to be precise. In March 1939, Germany annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. So the turnaround from Munich is just dramatic. And Churchill, the alarmist, has now been proved frighteningly, chillingly right. So Chamberlain has no choice when war breaks out in September 1939 but to bring him into the war cabinet. And in fact, he gives Churchill the same post that he occupied in 1914, which was First Lord of the Admiralty, in other words, in charge of the Navy that he'd been trying to run down in the 1920s.
So the big rival is now inside the tent. Would Chamberlain have been worried about his position?
And it's hard to say, but I don't think so. This was a man who was deeply saddened by his failure as a peacemaker, and I think had been chastened by that, the sort of roller coaster effect of the euphoria after Munich and then just being relentlessly proved wrong. And his heart wasn't in this conflict, he said to his sisters in another letter, he said, "How I do hate and loathe this war. I was never meant to be a war minister." Whereas Churchill, he added, was enjoying every moment of the war. The contrast between them, and going back to Churchill as a soldier in his youth and so on, but in his element in a way with war, whereas Chamberlain always thought of himself as a man of peace and a man of social reform and so on. And once Churchill's back in the Admiralty, in his usual way, he's looking for drama, for action. He's convinced that the war's not going to be won by sort of sitting back and staying on the defensive. And his big idea now is that he wants to take the war into the Baltic, up towards Norway, and to cut off Germany's supplies of iron ore from Sweden, which are an important part of the German economy. And his desire for action just creates friction with officials and ministers. And Chamberlain, again in another letter, laments that this is the price we have to pay for the asset we have in his personality and popularity. In other words, once again, you have a prime minister saying having Winston inside the tent is a mixed blessing. It's a double-edged sword, if you like. It cuts both ways, benefit and cost.
But then, ironically, Norway provided the opportunity for Churchill to take the job he really wanted.
Yes, that's right. Hitler moves first in Scandinavia. He invades Denmark and Norway in April 1940. And then the British attempt to save Norway is just a chaotic failure. Now, Winston, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was the minister largely responsible, and he could easily have been made the scapegoat for what had happened, as he had been in 1915 over Gallipoli. But the big difference was that then the Tories wanted revenge for the way that he, Winston, had deserted them and turned into a liberal. Now, in May 1940, Labour's resentment was directed at Neville Chamberlain for the failure of appeasement and for years of his sarcastic contempt for them in the House of Commons. They had it in for him. And they and some Tory rebels used an adjournment debate to show to Chamberlain that he'd lost much of his support in the Commons. They signalled after the vote that they would not serve in any coalition government led by Chamberlain, but they would work with Churchill as Prime Minister. And so Chamberlain resigns and Winston forms a coalition government.
Right. So then Churchill becomes Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And he keeps Chamberlain in the cabinet. So the rivals become colleagues again.
They do. But you see, you have to remember that Churchill is not the leader of any party. Chamberlain remains leader of the Conservative Party. And there's, quite a bit of a backlash in the Commons about the way that Chamberlain has been pulled down. There's a lot of Chamberlain loyalists who are still rather upset. Mm. So Churchill really has to keep him in the War Cabinet. And he gives him the job of looking after the home front. So Churchill, can concentrate on the war. And then, of course, the whole character of the war changes with the German invasion of France, the crisis over Dunkirk, the fall of France, the start of the Battle of Britain. And in these months, these really tough months, Churchill finds Chamberlain a loyal colleague, someone who really does look after the home side of the war, domestic side of the war, doesn't conspire against Churchill, no whispering campaigns or that sort of thing. Mm. And the other thing that's going on is also that Chamberlain is now diagnosed with cancer of the bowel, so very painful, very humiliating illness. And Churchill is very moved and impressed by Chamberlain's quiet courage. He carries on with the job, even though it's increasingly difficult to do so. And that's something that I think also turns their relationship as well. Churchill, as usual, a man who does have respect for others who are courageous in their own way. And I think his view of Chamberlain is changing quite sharply in those months.
You're reading about their relationship, and from your book, you get a sense of a very honourable side to Churchill. He's an energetic critic, certainly, an adversary, for sure, but in victory, very generous. He's not somebody, he's not one of these politicians that bears long grudges.
Yeah, I think that's right. He didn't kick a man when he was down in most cases. And I think that's perhaps because he'd been down so many times in his own career. He knew how it felt. And when he's got to give the valedictory oration in the Commons after Chamberlain's death, whether or not he thinks I was right and Neville was wrong, he takes a very magnanimous approach. And the words are still very striking. I think it's one of his noblest speeches, really. Churchill says this. He says, "In one phase, men seem to have been right. In another, they seem to have been wrong. Then again, a few years later, when the perspective of time has lengthened, all stands in a different setting." Throughout, Churchill continues, "The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. And whatever else history may or may not say about these terrible, tremendous years, we can be sure that Neville Chamberlain acted with perfect sincerity according to his lights and strove to the utmost of his capacity and authority, which were powerful, to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged."
Yeah.
I think that's a very moving set of words.
I think those are brilliant words, but they also show a brilliant judgment for human psychology that Churchill has, actually.
Yes. And a degree of compassion.
Finishing off, I suppose, how would you compare these two prime ministers? How would you compare Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill?
Well, Neville, I think, has the ambition of a marginalized younger son, and that pushes him to excel. He rose far and very, very high, and then he just falls precipitously after Munich goes sour. And what's ironic about that diplomacy in 1938 is that his trademark care and accuracy deserted him at the moment he needed it most, with that daring piece of personal diplomacy. It's almost as if he had become Churchillian. He'd gone for the bold political gestures, but at the wrong moment and in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Whereas Churchill, who Chamberlain had often accused of lacking judgment, was the one who got issues right in the 1930s over appeasement. But then the other irony, I think, is that big splash summitry that Chamberlain pioneered rather ineptly in 1938 was going to become Winston's trademark when he became Prime Minister. And we'll follow that story in the next couple of podcasts.
You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Please rate, review, and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. Follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram, and send us your comments and questions by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.